Here we go. If you look at one of the standard reference documents, one of the standard reference volumes on Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, the playwright, the Shakespeare Concordance, you start looking for such terms as, well, tonight's case, astronomical terms, we discover that rather surprisingly, Shakespeare makes quite a few mentions of astronomy, quite a bit of astronomy, quite a few mentions of, say, stars. There are 128 references to stars or star or stars in his plays, which seems quite surprising, really. Mostly they are simple metaphors. Many of them are astrological references. Note the difference between astronomy and astrology, two completely different subjects. He uses them in passing to add colour, to add variation to his writing. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars from Julius Caesar. One of the best known quotes that I could think of. There are other references to, say, planets in the night sky. Shakespeare, astronomer of his age, knew roughly what what planets were and where they sat in the cosmos. But Shakespeare makes a lot of references to them. Ah, barbarous villains, hast this lovely face ruled like a wandering planet over me, and could it not enforce them to relent, that were unworthy to behold the same. Now that language is very complicated, the meaning is not immediately apparent. So in a couple of examples tonight, I'll try to go through some of that language and try and explain what it actually means. There are a number of references to comets. Comets have been in the news lately. We had a particularly bright comet a few weeks ago. When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes is one of the best known quotes from Julius Caesar. You can tell I like Caesar. Shakespeare's astronomy, the astronomy of the day, isn't really astronomy as we would know it now. Shakespeare's astronomy is more correctly astronomy and astrology because the two were closely coupled at the hip, so to speak. Astronomers made their living as astrologers and vice versa. It was quite possible to make predictions using the objects in the sky as a template, perhaps, to guide human behavior. And that's one way that it's superstition. There's no real basis in science, no real basis in mathematics to explain astrology. But astrology was one of the predominant, say, sciences. They would call it a science, we wouldn't. We would just call it guesswork. So what's so special about Shakespeare's astronomy? Why am I talking about Shakespeare's astronomy tonight? What's so special about it? Well, simply put, it changes. It evolves. At the start of Shakespeare's career, when he's writing simple plays for a small audience, his astronomy is relatively unsophisticated. It's based largely upon the standard rote knowledge that he might have picked up, perhaps in his early education at school. He might have picked it up in taverns, that sort of thing. Hearsay. He's not a confirmed scholar. He's not an astronomer, certainly. But what we find is the plays get better, as he gets more experienced in writing plays, as he becomes better read, his point of view changes. And he starts to pick up information about the prevailing scientific developments of his time. And there were some significant changes afoot. If we look at Shakespeare's timeline, Shakespeare was born in 1564, February 1564. We don't have a precise date for when he was born. But in exactly the same year, just a couple of months later, the noted astronomer Galileo Galilei was born, roughly about April. Again, we're not really sure, about 6 weeks of each other. That is in itself significant. Copernicus, the Polish monk that helped describe our solar system in terms of a sun-centered system, rather than as Ptolemy, the ancient Greek astronomer, and the Catholic Church would have us believe that we lived in an earth-centered solar system, Copernicus changed all that, although he didn't quite believe it himself at the time, and his volumes were only published posthumously. The great Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, perhaps the last of the great naked-eye astronomers with the possible exception of Hevelius, he revolutionized our knowledge of the position of objects in the sky. His precision was hardly bettered for a century. Johannes Kepler, his assistant and prodigy, took Tycho Brahe's work and converted this into a mathematical formula that we could use to predict the motion of the stars and the planets in the sky. At the center of all this, we come across a curious character, Dr. John Dee. He has a somewhat strange reputation for a knowledge of the occult, a knowledge of the supernatural, which is perhaps undeserved because he was a scientist and a polymath, a mathematician, and so on. Giordano Bruno also enters into the story as a kind of wandering heretic, an outspoken priest, an outcast, pretty much expelled from every country in Europe, including the United Kingdom. He was a downright nuisance. We'll come to him a little bit later on. And of course, this is years before Isaac Newton, a century before Isaac Newton was born, the mathematician, astronomer, alchemist whose work we know and rely on today. So that puts him roughly in his timeline. So who was this Shakespeare bloke? Who was he? What would he have to do? Well, we know he spent his early life in Stratford-on-Avon. We know he was active in London between 1585, 1592. Thereupon he retired back to Stratford-on-Avon, seemed to have faded into anonymity at that point. We do know that he was the part owner of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a group of travelling players that seemed to be essentially concentrated around London, but did wander out of the capital occasionally. He had enjoyed a successful career as an actor, as a writer, and perhaps as a speaker. There was tangible evidence, slight evidence to suggest that. We do know that he authored 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and numerous other works. Several scholars dispute this. There are many theories, the Oxford theory, for instance, that suggests that the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, was in part responsible for some of his plays, Christopher Marlowe, again, others responsible. But for the moment, we're sticking with the theory that William Shakespeare was the author of these 39 plays and 154 sonnets. Here we are in a crude chronology just to sort of show the time scale that we're talking about some of his greater works, although there are many, many more works involved. So that's a rough idea of the timeline that we're talking about. To get an idea of what Shakespeare's world was like, we have to look at what the Elizabethan era was like, not just for the nobles, the nobility, those in power, but for the man and woman in the street. It was not a pleasant place to exist. It was not a pleasant place or world to live in. It was cruel and vindictive, evil punishments, food was scarce, we were constantly at war with our neighbours. But at the centre of this, the tabloids of the day, the broadcasting, the Sky, the Netflix of the day was the theatre. Theatre is everything. Theatre is a way of exchanging data through morality plays, a way of teaching people to live their lives according to a set of rules. It's a place where anarchists can, with some degree of subtlety, put forth new theories of political orders, doing away with the monarchy, but to do so in a very quiet, nondescript way. Maybe disguise it with a play or two or a comedy without giving away too much, because to challenge the state, to suggest that you might get rid of the king or queen was not a good idea. Europe is not a nice place. What makes Elizabethan England so special is that it's a relatively safe, calm place. Europe is not a nice place. The Spanish Inquisition, one of many inquisitions, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition is in full force. It was possible to be arrested without trial, tortured, executed even, for disagreeing with the local priest. Europe is not a nice place. You could be burned at the stake for disagreeing with the agreed doctrine of the church. Again, not a nice place. And England is a relatively stable, safe country. It's a safe haven for philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, engineers, and again, to a limited degree, those who would challenge the religious standards of the day. It was a stable, safe country unless you were a dog or a bear baiting, dog fighting, or a Catholic. It was very, very dangerous if you were a Catholic or admitted to be a Catholic. There was some leeway given, but if you challenged the state or was shown to be a papist, then you could expect some pretty rough treatment. This is, of course, not long after the Renaissance, where science starts to take over and prosper over superstition. Atheism starts to rear its ugly head. The Renaissance gives rise to science, gives rise to mathematics, gives rise to physics, to engineering. It makes life more understandable. Instead of relying on imaginary beasts, imaginary beings working behind the scenes, operating the universe mysteriously and out of touch, along come physicists like Galileo and his contemporaries who tell us how the world works, who explain to us how mechanics work, how a cannonball flies in flight, how a lever works, how a pendulum swings, that sort of thing. Religion doesn't do this. And around the same time, this Polish monk that we mentioned earlier on, Nicholas Copernicus, he starts doing some rather intriguing mathematics based on the work of the Islamic astronomers and observational astronomers of the day. He decides that the prevailing system, this Earth-centered system with Earth at the center of a series of concentric crystal spheres with the planets and the stars stuck to these spheres, doesn't work. It doesn't bear up to scrutiny. It doesn't match observational evidence. Copernicus comes up with a so-called heliocentric system with the sun at the center of our particular solar system. It's widely accepted among scholars across Europe for those who dare speak its name. It is at odds with Catholic doctrine. To discuss it openly, to challenge the church, is to invite trouble. As Copernicus discovered long after, well, he didn't discover it, his works were published posthumously long after he died. 1616, it became prohibited to have a copy of Copernicus's work. His books, De Revolutionibus, was entered into the index of banned books. In other words, if you were caught with a copy, you would be prosecuted and possibly executed by the church. Protestant England is the only safe place to discuss these new views. Thanks, because we have a Protestant queen on the throne, an open tolerance of, or a more open tolerance of religion, unless you go against the crown, and a scientific meritocracy, which seems to be at work at the top of the country. Copernicus's books make interesting reading. They're beautifully laid out. I've included this just because I like the look of it. And again, here we see somebody scribbled in the margins. To us, we would look at this today and we would go, this makes sense. This is sort of physics and astronomy that you would do if you went to university. Copernicus uses the science and the maths of the day to describe the shape and form of our solar system in terms that academics can understand. This is beyond the work of the man in the street. This is important. It's beyond the understanding of the man in the street. You need a degree in mathematics of the day to understand this stuff. Earth is no longer at the center of the universe, which causes some problems amongst the people as well. They don't like seeing the church knocked off its pedestal, so to speak. The important thing is that the theatres are able to communicate some of these ideas. Some of Shakespeare's ideas tend to suggest, some of his plays suggest that Shakespeare himself is rattling along with these, he's wrestling with these possibilities about how the earth might not be at the center of the universe. We'll come to that later on. Around this time, 1564 onwards, into 1600, Galileo Galilei, the astronomer that we talked about earlier, he begins observing the sky with a telescope. He's not the only person observing the sky with his telescope. He is one of many, as we will come to. He begins observing the night sky. He observes the planet Jupiter and immediately discovers that Jupiter is in fact orbited by 4 moons. We call them Ganymede, Callisto, Europa, and Io. They're pretty big. You can see them with just a pair of binoculars if you know where to look. Jupiter is visible tonight. Ask me why, and I'll tell you later on. Galileo's conclusions was that if Jupiter is orbited by 4 moons, therefore not all celestial bodies orbit the Earth. Hang on, that's not what he's been taught. That's not what we know and recognize as the truth. He writes his notes down. His observations down. He records these little observations. He notes that these moons look like fireflies dancing around the disk of Jupiter. He's puzzled as to what these might be. He starts observing the moon. He starts observing sunspots on the sun, imperfections on the sun. He comes to the conclusion that therefore not all celestial bodies are perfect. Again, this is at odds with what he has been taught. He makes observations of the planet Venus and discovers that it exhibits phases in exactly the same way as the moon does around Earth. He concludes that just as the moon orbits the Earth, so Venus orbits the sun. How can that be possible if everything orbits the Earth, if Earth is at the center of the universe? Galileo publishes documents in a book, his discoveries in a book called The Starry Messenger. He immediately is put under house arrest for disagreeing with Catholic doctrine. It does not end well. He's in prison for about the next 30 years. He still does good scientific work, but he's effectively under house arrest. It's at odds with the Catholic doctrine of the times. He's gone against the church and the church doesn't like it. Another person who suffered terribly at the hands of the church is Giordano Bruno, who we mentioned earlier on. He says there are countless suns and countless earths, all rotating around their suns in exactly the same way as the 7 planets in our solar system. And he said that, we think, around 1610, predating by about 400 years our discovery of exoplanets, planets that revolve around distant stars. So it's a remarkable leap of faith. It's a remarkably brave statement to make, although unfortunately it too is at odds with the teaching of the Catholic Church. Bruno's books are immediately placed on the forbidden list. Bruno himself is burned at the stake for heresy on the 1st of February 1600. So we can see that going against the church is not a good thing. If you compare and contrast that with Elizabeth in England, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Harriot, who began his observations of Jupiter, the moon, and Venus just months before Galileo began his observations. He was able to successfully record craters on the moon. He's able to successfully record sunspots, do experiments with magnetism, all that sort of thing. And he did so without being molested in any way by the church. He was allowed to publish, and by and large, Harriot's work was largely forgotten until relatively recently, when there was a major resurgence of interest in the work that he'd done. Don't forget Harriot, though. We'll come back to Harriot later on in this missive, and for very good reasons. But in the beginning, getting back to Shakespeare, when Shakespeare begins writing, Shakespeare's god, so to speak, is Aristotle. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, the Greek scientist, who set forth a series of theories about how the universe worked. He had very little experimental evidence to show how that might be true, but he went with it. It's a theory, it's a starting point. Unfortunately, in this Earth-centered system, it was adopted as canon, and that meant that anybody who disagreed with the church's position on the Aristotelian view of the universe could get themselves into trouble. Aristotle is very, very important to early Shakespeare's writing. His early writing, say for an example in Hamlet, which is okay, so it's later on in the evolution of his series of plays, he makes a reference that says, "Doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt that I love." What does it actually mean? It really means, in plain English, you may wonder if the stars are fire, you may wonder if the sun moves across the sky, you may wonder if the truth is a liar, but never wonder if I love. So it's putting it into plain English. A lot of people have trouble reading and understanding. I do. I have terrible trouble understanding half of what he says. But he's pretty much quoting Aristotle. This is Aristotelian theory, even though Aristotle is kind of looking a bit outdated. The same is true later on of his views of the sun. The sun is mentioned very, very frequently in many of Shakespeare's pieces, usually referencing by its rising and its setting, its passage through the zodiac, through the constellations that we know as our birth sign. The weary sun hath made a golden set, and by the bright track of his fiery car gives token of a goodly day tomorrow, from Richard III. Boy, did he get that wrong. O thou clear God and patron of all light, from whom each lamp and shining star doth borrow the beauteous influence that makes him bright from Venus and Adonis. It's an interesting sort of set of ideas. He's acknowledging that the sun is the source of light and heat in our solar system, and he's also acknowledging that the planets and the moon shine by reflected sunlight. Now, if you think about it, think if you're sitting in the audience listening to one of these plays, and you're familiar with the language of the day, and you come across an astronomical reference like this, it's a form of education. You're learning as you're being entertained. And I kind of hope that this is working out now, otherwise people are switching off. But it's quite an advanced idea to imagine that the planets and the moon do not shine by light of their own, they shine by reflected sunlight. The heavens themselves, the planets, and this center observe degree, priority, and place. And therefore, in the glorious planet Sol, in noble eminence, enthroned and sphered amidst the other, from Troilus and Cressida, it's a complicated set of ideas, complicated sentence. He's saying Aristotle, he's following along with Aristotle, that the sun follows other planets in circles around the earth. Shakespeare imagines that the sun is a planet like the earth, Mars, and Venus. It's not burning. So you see how his ideas are at odds with each other. Sometimes he writes as if he knows what he's talking about from a point of view. Maybe he's getting into the heads of his characters. Maybe he's imagining what they would be saying. But this is at odds with, it conflicts with some of the other plays that he's written. When we talk about the moon, Antony and Cleopatra, he talks about the sovereign mistress of true melancholy. It's an astrological reference more than anything else. The moon's an errant thief, and her pale fire she snatches from the sun. Again, it's another reference to the sun, the moon shining by the reflected light of the sun. Timon of Athens, which came later, how come the noble Timon to this change? As the moon does by wanting light to give, but then renew I could not like the moon, so there were no suns to borrow of. Again, it's this idea, this repeated theory that the stars, the moon, the planets and the moon reflect by reflected sunlight. They don't have any light of their own. Shakespeare is aware that the moon shines by reflected light. It's a complicated idea. Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon, that mostly changes in a circled orb, lest thy love prove likewise variable from Romeo and Juliet. What's he alluding to here? The inconstant moon. Shakespeare's alluding to the cycle of phases, eclipses and control of the tides. He seems to know an awful lot about that. He's also complaining about the fickle and unstable nature of lovers, and that they're unable to keep their promises, they're inconstant. Their moods shift and change according to external influences. They're fickle. When we think about Othello, when we look at Othello, and you look at the conversation between Iago and Othello, why is this? Thinkest thou I'd make life of jealousy, to follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicions? In other words, Iago is feeding a constant series of lies and half-truths and untruths to sway his point of view, to get him to betray his wife. What does it actually mean? Why are you telling me this? Why do you think I would live a life of jealousy, tormented by new suspicions every hour? It's a strange way of looking at the world, but it's very much Othello. It is the very, and this is a complicated one again from Othello, it is the very error of the moon that comes more nearer Earth than she was wont, and makes men mad. There's a complicated, different series of ideas there. Let's look at them. The moon is certainly associated with madness, lunacy. The moon does not move in a perfect circle. She comes more nearer Earth than she was wont. Shakespeare is acknowledging that the moon moves in an elliptical orbit, where most of us are familiar these days with the concept of a supermoon, where the moon is apparently bigger in the sky than certain months than others. We call it supermoon, although the difference is little more than a couple of percent when you look at it in real terms. It's an optical illusion more than anything. But he's acknowledging that the moon does not move in a circular orbit around the Earth. He's also accepting that the moon still orbits around the Earth. This aberration or irregularity, we've got, a good measure of it now. The moon wobbles on its axis, a process that we look at the phases of the moon. We know that the moon shows us a different constant face, always pointed towards us. A process that we know is different. It's caused by a phenomenon called resonance. But why does the moon always present the same face? It doesn't always present the same face. It wobbles, so to speak, and I'm kind of hoping that this is going to work. It's a process called lunar libration. It means that we can see roughly 60% of the surface of the moon that points towards us. The moon wobbles on its axis. Is it going to do it? Yes, it is. You should see it from here. Here's a series of photographs taken a couple of days apart to show the moon wobbling on its axis. So as you can see, it's called lunar libration. It means that we can see roughly 60% of the surface of the moon that points in our direction. Shakespeare seems aware of this. Doth the moon shine that night we play our play? From Midsummer Night's Dream, a calendar. Look in the almanac. Yes, it doth shine that night. What this alludes to is calendars. Shakespeare is not just a casual observer of the moon. He knows roughly when the moon is going to shine. There are calendars available. He has access to calendars, accurate calendars that predict when we're going to have a full moon and when the moon is not going to be visible. Again, eclipses, these things that take place in the sky when the moon becomes between the sun and the earth. They occur infrequently in Shakespeare's writing, but he knows about them. Well, eclipses around that time, they do occur quite frequently, usually more often lunar eclipses more frequently than solar eclipses. They're usually treated as a bad omen. They foretell something bad about to happen. Alack, our terrene moon is now eclipsed, and it portends alone the fall of Antony, from Antony and Cleopatra. These late eclipses of the sun and moon portend no good to us, from King Lear. So again, we're seeing this familiar pattern that eclipses mean something bad is about to happen. And maybe Shakespeare is telling something about what happens on Earth here. What does it actually allude to? Why does Shakespeare include this particular reference to eclipses in King Lear? On the 17th of September 1605, we can be absolutely sure that a partial lunar eclipse was observed over London. Now, lunar eclipses and solar eclipses usually go hand in hand. They're not always visible, but solar eclipses are not always visible at the same, roughly within a month of each other. But we do know that in October 1605, a total solar eclipse was observed over London. That's interesting. Christmas 1606, King Lear is first performed before King James in Whitehall. That's very special. That's very interesting, because it seems that Shakespeare has witnessed this event in the sky and he has incorporated it into his play. It would still be fresh in the memory of his audiences, who would be able to equate what they were seeing on the stage with what had happened recently in the sky. Shakespeare has a particular view of the planets themselves. They only knew of about 7 planets in the sky. They didn't know about Uranus, they didn't know about Neptune or Pluto, because they hadn't been discovered. They weren't discovered until the advent of the telescope. From an astrological point of view, and Shakespeare uses many of these astrological points of view to associate them with characters within his plays. Mercury is associated with elusiveness, with trickery. Venus, the planet of love. Mars, the god of war, stayed with us certainly since Roman times. Saturn is associated with old age and evil. Jupiter, I've missed out of that list, the bringer of jollity, reflected in Holst the Planets, of course. Planet references within Shakespeare's plays are nearly always astrological. He knows about conjunctions and oppositions, and he suspects that they influence human affairs. A conjunction is we have more than one planet appearing close together in the night sky. For instance, we have a conjunction at the moment between the planet Jupiter and the planet planet Saturn, taking place in the south and southern part of the sky in the UK, rising at about 9 o'clock at night. Very, very easy to spot. They have been significantly closer over the past year or so. They are now drifting apart. But opposition is when the planet is on the opposite side of the sun's orbit for us. It's complicated. We'll come back to that later at this time. But the movement of the planets, they account for the variability of human nature, the changes and shifts in mood, changes and shifts in somebody's fortune, borrowed from astrological terms. Venus and Saturn this year in conjunction. What says the almanac to that? Says King Henry IV. Curious. Shakespeare also knows about something a little bit more complicated. He certainly knew about the unusual orbit and retrograde motion of Mars. See, Mars is what we call an exterior planet, and if we map the position of Mars against the night sky, we find that it does little loops, and that is caused because Mars moves around, takes longer to move around the sun than the Earth does. So from our vantage point on Earth, Mars tends to do a little loop every now and again. For the past year or so, Mars has been moving forward in its trajectory. As of last night, Mars began to move what we call retrograde. Mars is true moving, says Shakespeare, even as in the heavens, so in the earth, to this day is not known. But they had a clue to it. If they'd studied the passage of Mars, this is from 2011, if you trace the passage of Mars across the night sky over a period of months, you will find it does these little loops, these little retrograde loops. Mars is in some instances moving backwards from our point of view across the sky. And it's judged to be some form of change and shift in somebody who is ruled by Mars. Maybe their fortunes, maybe their moods, maybe their love life changes. The wars have so kept you under that you must needs be born under Mars, from all's well that ends well. So Shakespeare seems to know about the unusual orbit and retrograde motion. Again, from all's well that ends well. The wars have so kept you under that must needs born under Mars. Yes, he was predominant, says Parolles. Helena, when was he retrograde? I think rather. Why think you so? You go so much backwards when you fight. That's for advantage. So you see what I mean? It's a complicated idea represented in simple verse. Mercury is treated similarly. Who, being as I am, littered under Mercury, was likewise a snapper up of inconsiderate trifles from A Winter's Tale. Again, it alludes to Mercury being, well, playful, elusive. Mercury is an incredibly difficult planet to spot. In all of the 40 years I've been an amateur astronomer, I've only seen Mercury about 4 times, 5 times with any certainty. It's very, very difficult to spot, and as a consequence, Mercury is associated with elusiveness, trickery, tomfoolery, japes, that sort of thing. Saturn, the planet Saturn, as I said earlier on, is associated with old age and evil. The legends about Saturn being evil go back to Roman and Greek mythology, but as it appears in one of the sonnets, "From you have I been absent in the spring, when proud-pied April, dressed in all his trim, hath put a spirit of youth in everything, that heavy Saturn laughed and leapt with him." Saturn is the gloomy god of death and winter, the chill winter, and boy do we feel it today. He's a deity of melancholy, of sadness, of loss. Govern those of a gloomy and sour disposition. I'm sure we all know somebody like that today, associated with old age and fading from the world, and it's sad. And this is a recurring theme, a recurring meme throughout Shakespeare's plays. Comets feature infrequently. We've mentioned earlier on, when beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes, from Julius Caesar. Very well-known quote. From Henry VI, Part 1, comets importing change of time and states, brandish your crystal tresses to the sky. Again, Shakespeare knows what comets are. He knows that comets happen. He knows that comets are unpredictable, they're unreliable, taciturn. They didn't know about the periodicity of comets. They didn't know about, say, Halley's comet that comes back every 76 years. They had no concept of that. There were hints and suggestions that it might be the case, but nobody had much in the way of absolute concrete data. So comets are a mystery, an enigma. They visit, they turn up every now and again. Nobody has any idea what they're made of, or indeed how far away they are. Are they objects within our own atmosphere, or are they objects some distance away in space? And this is a mystery, an enigma to the astronomers and scientists of Shakespeare's time. The same applies much to meteors, shooting stars, little stars shot from their fixed places, he says. Earth-treading stars that make the dark heaven light. They're mentioned fairly frequently, not that frequently. Shakespeare, like others, has no real understanding of their true nature, but he does reckon they reflect superstition, a superstitious belief. He has no real solid news of what they are, but he does realize that there may be some kind of star that escaped its proper sphere, its proper orbit. They're wandering in the space between the stars. My lord, do you see these meteors? Do you behold these exhalations? What do you think they portend? From Henry IV. "'Tis thought the king is dead, we will not stay. The bay trees in our country are all withered, and meteors fright the fixed stars of heaven." Again, unpredictable, no idea when they're going to turn up. But he does suggest that some of these meteors come in clouds, in patterns, in groups. Meteor showers like the Perseids, the ever boring Perseids that we have to endure every August. Like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance bred, of one substance bred. There's the clue that he knows something about meteors turning up in showers. A common cause, perhaps. Shakespeare makes, as I said, frequent mention of stars, 128 references to stars in total throughout the concordance. "But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament," says Julius Caesar. But this is a curious addition, because it had been known from ancient times that the constant star, the northern star that he's talking about, has shifted in position. For back in the time of the Greeks, the Phoenicians, it was known, well, thousands upon thousands of years ago, it was known that the north celestial pole was nowhere near the North Star as it is now. It tends to wander. And this is a well-known phenomenon these days. But in Shakespeare's time, it's difficult. He's alluding perhaps that Julius Caesar may well be inconstant, may well have a surprise waiting for him, beware the Ides of March and so forth. From the play Two Noble Kinsmen, the jailer's daughter, I am very cold and all the stars are out too. The little stars and all that look like aglets, I'm at a loss to discover what an aglet is. If you know, please tell me. I couldn't find out today. It alludes to exceptionally cold nights, and the Elizabethan winters were exceptionally cold when the Thames froze over. A thoroughly miserable time if you had to spend any time out of doors. Much fainter stars can be seen on nights like this when the Earth's atmosphere is calm and still, and there's not much heat rising from the surface. It's a good time to do astronomy in winter. Shakespeare makes frequent references to groups of stars, namely the Pleiades, but we're a little bit unsure what he means when he talks about the seven sisters. There's a group of stars, they're visible around midnight over in the east about this time of year, called the seven sisters. They're seven stars that hang together in the sky, part of the constellation Taurus, the bull. These stars came from the same nebula, the Merope Nebula. They're all roughly the same age, the same color, the same chemistry, the same sort of physics, and they hang together in a group in the sky. Shakespeare seems to know about them, talks about them in King Lear. I will forget my nature, so kind a father, be my horses ready? Fool replies, thy asses are gone about them. The reason why the seven stars are no more than seven is pretty reason, because they are not eight. Yes, indeed, thou wouldst make a good fool, says Fool. Ha! Tick against perforce. Monster ingratitude, says Lear. Again, complicated terms, complicated language. But what is Shakespeare alluding to? Maybe not talking about the Pleiades, maybe not talking about this strange group. He may be talking about something else entirely. It is lost on us from our vantage point now. The meaning is lost. We that take Perseus go by the moon and the seven stars and not by Phoebus. Phoebus is an old medieval term for the sun. It comes from Greek mythology, Phoebus and sun. The seven stars, we think, may have applied to the Pleiades, but it may not. You see, the seven stars also feature in the constellation the Plough, Ursa Major, the Big Dipper to our American cousins. We that take Perseus go by the moon and the seven stars and not by Phoebus. He's alluding to cutpurses, thieves, vagabonds who would snatch your wallet, your purse from your pocket. They do their business, their dark deeds by night. They steal, they burgle houses. The plough had a number of different names. Ursa Major is how we know it these days. That's what astronomers call it. But it was also in those days known as King Charles Wain. The constellation Ursa Major is what we call a circumpolar constellation, circumpolar, meaning that it goes around the North Pole star and it is always visible from the United Kingdom. It doesn't set below the horizon. It's not always get very low to the northern horizon, but it is always visible from most parts of the United Kingdom. And as a consequence, if you knew where the plough was in the sky, you might be able to use it as a means of telling the time. The plough was used for telling the time in Shakespeare era before the time when everybody had a pocket watch. Vast numbers of the population had no easy means of telling the time at night. So using the plough, using the constellation in the sky was a reliable way of telling the time. If we get more complicated, if we look at, say, Shakespeare's constellations, Shakespeare's use of stars, plays like The Tempest. I find my zenith does depend upon a most auspicious star, whose influence I now court, but but omit my fortunes will ever after droop. Complicated series, but Shakespeare and Prospero have much in common. What does it mean? As I see it, my fate hangs on this lucky event. Now, if I handle it wrong, I'll suffer for the rest of my life. It talks about Prospero, who's been marooned on a far-flung island. Those of us who are interested in science fiction may not realize it, but The Forbidden Planet, a movie from about 1951, is little more than Shakespeare's Tempest in another format. It was rewritten for Hollywood around about 1949, 1950, and in which a group of explorers land on a planet some way off in space, an unknown part of the universe. There they discover a magical spirit, Ariel, in the form of Robbie the Robot. There's a love interest, Miranda, daughter of Prospero the magician. The isle is full of noises. Professor Mobius, aka Prospero, has many tricks, many ideas, and undiscovered technology that he's keeping secret. There is something deep and dark and horrible at the center of this island. Shakespeare's The Tempest, rewritten for Hollywood. Shakespeare doesn't really make much mention of astronomical instruments, They do come up every now and again, but sundials were very ancient, very commonplace. You could get a portable sundial, a device that you could carry in your pocket and use to tell the time within an hour or two. It was useful for setting up business meetings. You can buy replicas of them today, although personally I prefer my little Timex watch that I have on the desk in front of me. Here's one of these devices, one of these portable sundials. You simply held it up in the direction of the sun and allowed the sun's shadow to fall on the inside of the ring, worn as a finger ring, and it would give you the time. Not accurately, but accurately enough. He drew a dial from his pocket and looking on it with a lackluster eye says very wisely, "It is 10 o'clock," from play As You Like It. From Henry V, as many lines so close in the dial's centre, so may 1,000 actions once afoot end in one purpose. But Shakespeare leaves us dangling. He leaves strange puzzles and enigmas hidden in his writings. Where did he get some of these ideas from? Did he take them from other people? Who were his inspirations? Did he study the events of the day? Did he listen to political discourse? Who did he associate with? We get a clue to some of the people he was hanging around with in London sometime later. And they're lettered in, say, for instance, this play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard. Who were Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? Well, the two minor characters from the play Hamlet. What do they mean? Well, the treacherous Franz of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, I won't give it away, but something ill happens to them. Were these names chosen just to sound Danish? Were they names that had just been pulled out of a hat? Perhaps to give, Hamlet's not a particularly Danish name, I'd have thought. So who were Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? To figure that puzzle out, we have to dig a little bit deeper to one of the astronomers that we mentioned earlier on, Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman, something rotten in the state of Denmark, alluding to Hamlet. Tycho is famous because he was a Danish nobleman. He was incredibly rich for the time. He pretty much owned most of Denmark. He was rich enough to afford a pet elk and a pet dwarf. He also had a brass nose. He lost a substantial part of his nose, much of the bridge of his nose, in a duel while he was away at German university. He lost it to his close cousin, who was a better swordsman than he. And for the rest of his life, he wore a brass nose. For special occasions, he would pull out a silver nose, and for extremely special occasions, like a visit from the king, he would wear a golden nose. Some have suggested that he managed to poison himself, but maybe if this time we'll look at that later. Tycho was a brilliant, practical, observational astronomer. His observations of the sky, done with just the naked eye and a series of armillary spheres, much like the one on the illustration there on the left, were of particular interest. He did really, really good quality observations there. One of the places that I want to go before I kick off this mortal coil is the island of Hven in Denmark to see the Tycho Brahe Museum, where he was based. Tycho's star is particularly of note. It was big and it was bright and it shone in the skies above England at a time when Shakespeare was active. Most of the population would have seen a very bright star in the sky. Tycho certainly saw it, but he was puzzled as to what it was. And his long-term studies of the position of this star against the celestial firmament concluded that Tycho's star was not an object in our atmosphere, as had the theory of the day prevailed. It was wrong. He concluded that it was a great deal very, very far away. I conclude, therefore, that the star is not some kind of comet or a fiery meteor, but it is a star shining in the firmament itself, one that has never previously been seen before in our time in any age since the beginning of the world. It's a very, very important observation. Tycho is keen to see his brand of astronomy, his particular skill as an observer. He's keen to capitalize on it, to make sure that his work is not forgotten, to make sure that his work is widely disseminated around Europe. We do know that Tycho wrote to the leading English Copernican astronomers of the day, and he did so around about 1589, 1590. We do know that he wrote a volume a letter to Sir Thomas Savile, a thoroughly rotten egg who was in trouble from all sides of the political sphere, ended up jailed in the Tower of London. He incurred the displeasure of Parliament. He fought on both sides of the wrong war. Even my friend, the Duke of Newcastle, felt impelled to trash Savile's castle at some point. Savile, a thoroughly unpleasant person who could be the subject of a WEA members lecture. Tycho enclosed a copy of his book, published 1588, An Introduction to the New Astronomy, where Tycho talks about his discoveries in the sky, his positions of the stars and that sort of thing, and his way he thinks that the solar system works, which is slightly at odds with the work of Copernicus, but it's a working model. Tycho critically includes 4 copies of a portrait. It's a picture of himself, complete with his brass nose, surrounded by a stone arch, and that arch is replete with heraldic shields, dating all of, or as many of Tycho's ancestors as he can accommodate. And if we look closely at the names on those heraldic shields, we discover Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and that alludes to 2 distant ancestors of Tycho Brahe, Sophie Guildenstern and Eric Rosencrantz. So is this the origin of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? And if it is, there's no solid tangible evidence that suggests this. Where did Shakespeare get these names from? It suggests that Shakespeare himself may have seen copies of Tycho's book, may have seen copies of this heraldic shield, is this portrait. If we look at the timeline of Tycho Brahe's visit to the United Kingdom, it comes before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, or certainly before Hamlet was first performed. So it seems very likely circumstantial evidence suggests that Tycho knew about Hamlet. We then have to look at some of Shakespeare's associates to draw a few more conclusions. He was known to hang around and known to be friends with Christopher Marlowe, playwright, celebrated atheist, homosexual, collaborator, and potential spy. He worked for the government, keeping an eye on all these filthy, degenerate poets. Marlowe was a known associate of Sir Walter Raleigh. We know that for sure. He also co-authored several works with the celebrated poet George Chapman, who is discussed numerous times in Shakespeare's sonnets, this so-called rival poet. He's one of many possible associate, the rival poets that have been pinpointed as potential candidates. We still don't know. There's nothing tangible there. This is kind of guilt by association. Have a go at me if you want. Thomas Kidd, a celebrated playwright who is largely forgotten these days, was arrested for his alleged part in the gunpowder plot. That's puzzling in itself. Under torture, Kidd implicates Marlowe, Raleigh, and the astronomer Thomas Harriot as being co-conspirators, probably just going through his address book and finding somebody else to blame to get out from under all of this torture, which could be particularly vicious. All of them, Marlowe, Raleigh, and Harriot, were found to be innocent. Leonard Digges, a close friend of the Shakespeare family. He was well known to Shakespeare. He was a surveyor, cartographer, a military engineer, an author. We know that he invented an astronomical telescope before Galileo did. His son, Thomas Digges, also an astronomer, made significant contributions to Elizabethan astronomy. Again, Shakespeare would have been familiar with the family. He was a known associate of Thomas Harriot. The two worked together and exchanged correspondence on astronomical themes. Harriot himself was a known associate of Walter Raleigh. Harriot accompanied Raleigh on his famous voyage to Virginia in 1585. We still have some of Harriot's drawings from that era. We also know that Raleigh and Harriot were known associates of the famous poet Sir Philip Sidney, who was regarded for a time as one of England's finest authors of sonnets and would have been known to Shakespeare. It was Sidney who invited the heretic Giordano Bruno to England in 1583 for a potential audience with John Dee, then Elizabeth I's master soothsayer, spy monist, alchemist, philosopher, geographer. There are no records that the meeting ever took place. There's no documentation if it wasn't that anything ever took place between them, but there's merely the suggestion that Bruno the heretic, Bruno the troublemaker, arrived in England. We know he certainly arrived in England. He certainly was allowed to speak a bit in England, but he was later banned from the likes of Oxford University for criticising the scholars there. But these associates of Shakespeare, he may have known them, all of them. Sir Walter Raleigh, Marlowe, Harriet Chapman. What have they got in common? What binds them all together? And it's an elusive club, the so-called School of Night, a secret cabal of New Age thinkers and atheists and revolutionary thinkers, free to discuss religion or the lack of it, free to discuss science, philosophy, the new knowledge coming over from Europe. Shakespeare was never formally identified as a member of the group, but he certainly knew or could have known most of his members. It's guilt by association. Perhaps I'm tarring him with it. Shakespeare did give them the name from the play Love Labour's Lost. Black is the badge of hell, the hue of dungeons and the school of night. So there's the name. What does Shakespeare himself think of astronomers? We're winding down to a close now. Those of you who have got itchy trigger fingers who want to ask questions, and I can see there are a fair number of questions queuing up. Shakespeare writes of astronomers, these earthly godfathers of heaven's lights that give a name to every fixed star, have no more profit of their shining lights than those that walk and what not and where they are. Too much to know is to know naught but fame. And every godfather can give a name from Love Labour. Again, Love Labour's Lost. But I'll leave the final, most damning criticism to one of Shakespeare's, Ben Jonson. Tut, these starmonger knaves, who would trust them. One says dark and rainy when 'tis as clear as a crystal. Another says tempestuous blasts and storms, and 'twas as calm as a milk bowl. Here be sweet rascals for a man to credit his whole fortunes with. You sky staring coxcombs, you fat brains, out upon you. You are good for nothing but to sweat nightcaps and to make rug gowns dear. You learned men and have not legion of devils of votre service by heaven. I think I shall die a better scholar than they. I want to get that made into a t-shirt. That should be the way astronomers present themselves these days. I think Ben Jonson's got them nailed pretty much. Lastly, Shakespeare's take on cosmology. This is where we're seeing his true colours emerging. Yes, his work does encapsulate the intellectual world of Aristotle, but he also seems to embrace and welcome the new science coming in from Europe, the new Copernican system. Galileo and all of his contemporaries are overthrowing Aristotle's view of physics, Aristotle's view of the world. This new knowledge is becoming more commonly available, and Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights are helping to disseminate this information to the public at large. So the public at large might not be immediately aware of what's going on, but they're certainly being educated. Even today, look at his work. Few of Shakespeare's contemporaries can match his knowledge of the sun and the moon. And others have rather cruelly suggested this may not be the work of one man, that may be the work of Edward de Vere, Duke of Oxford, Earl of Oxford, that it may be the work of, say, Marlowe, or maybe even Raleigh is at some point in time credited with contributing to some of Shakespeare's plays, or in fact all of them. But Shakespeare's knowledge of the sun and the moon, he knows about eclipses, conjunctions, oppositions, retrograde motion. Very knowledgeable. He knows about stars, constellations, comets, meteors. He knows all of these things and puts them into his play with some considerable authority. He talks about cosmology, and this is perhaps one of his most advanced ideas. Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Is he alluding to the infinite nature of the cosmos, that we don't know where the universe begins? And, well, we know it begins with a big bang, but where does the universe end? Is he perhaps alluding to perhaps there may be one or more universes to very, very distant places? We're not sure. He talks about it only very, very infrequently. In fact, I can only find one immediate reference to it in Hamlet. And that, my friends, is Shakespeare's astronomy. We've seen Shakespeare evolve from a simple, talking about Aristotelian astronomy in a very simple way. It's the astronomy that he's learned perhaps from school, learned by rote, learned by talking with his peers. But we've seen him move through Copernican astronomy into something really quite advanced, really quite difficult to grasp for the time. And that's the miracle of Shakespeare's astronomy, and perhaps why we'll keep talking about him